Imagine a cold London morning in the year 1555. The air smells of smoke from kitchen fires and frost crunches underfoot. But today, the smoke will not come from a kitchen. Crowds are gathering in the square. People push and jostle to get closer, their breath making little clouds in the winter air. They are not here for a festival or a market or a play. They are here to see something terrible, something ordered by their queen. In the center of the square stands a tall wooden stake. Around it are bundles of dry sticks and straw. Soon, a man will be tied there. Soon, flames will rise, and soon his screams will mix with the cheering, the gasps, and the silence of the crowd. This is not a punishment for theft or murder. This man's crime is believing in the wrong version of Christianity, and the queen who ordered it believes she is saving his soul. Her name is Mary Tudor. History remembers her as Bloody Mary. Mary was not born a monster. She entered the world in 1516, the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She grew up in a world of palaces, silk dresses, tutors, music, and pageantry. She could speak Latin, French, and Spanish by the time she was a teenager. She played music, danced, and could ride a horse with elegance. More than anything, she loved her mother, who raised her to be a faithful Catholic. At that time, England was part of the Catholic Church, and the Pope in Rome was its leader. Religion was not just belief, it was law, politics, and identity all in one. But everything changed when her father, King Henry, fell in love with another woman, Anne Boleyn. Anne refused to be his mistress. She wanted to be his wife. There was just one problem. Henry was still married to Catherine. When the Pope refused to give Henry a divorce, Henry broke from the Catholic Church. He created the Church of England, with himself as its head. This was one of the biggest political and religious changes in England's history. For Mary, it was a personal disaster. Her parents' marriage was declared invalid. She was stripped of her title as princess and called illegitimate. She lost her place at court and was forced to serve in the household of her baby half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Worse, Mary was forbidden to see her mother. When Catherine died in 1536, Mary could not say goodbye. She was devastated. This humiliation and her loyalty to her mother's faith would shape the rest of her life. Mary survived 3 reigns before her own, first her father, then her young half-brother Edward VI, who ruled as a strict Protestant. Under Edward, Catholic practices were banned, priests married, Latin prayers were replaced with English, and churches were stripped of their decorations. Mary refused to give up her Catholic beliefs, which made her a symbol of resistance for English Catholics. When Edward died in 1553, powerful Protestant nobles tried to block Mary from the throne. They placed her Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on it instead. But Mary was determined. She gathered supporters, and people flocked to her cause. Many remembered her mother with respect. Others missed the old religion. In just 9 days, Mary took the throne. Lady Jane Grey was removed and later executed. Mary's coronation in October 1553 was a grand event. She wore deep crimson robes and a crown heavy with jewels. Crowds cheered as she rode through London, the first woman to rule England in her own right. At first, she promised she would not force anyone to change religion. She spoke of mercy and unity. But Mary had one goal above all: to return England to the Catholic Church. In 1554, she married Philip II of Spain, the most powerful Catholic ruler in Europe. Mary saw this as a holy alliance. But many of her people hated the idea. They feared England would become a tool of Spain, and that their laws would be controlled by a foreign king. That same year, a rebellion led by Sir Thomas Wyatt broke out. It was crushed, but it made Mary more determined to act quickly. By late 1554, England had officially returned to the Catholic Church, Heresy laws were restored, and in February 1555, the burnings began. The first victim was John Rogers, a preacher who had helped translate the Bible into English. Officials told him he could live if he accepted Catholic teaching. He refused. On the day of his execution, he walked calmly to the stake, smiling at friends in the crowd. His wife and children stood nearby. The fire rose, and his body was consumed before their eyes. The authorities staged these executions in public squares. They wanted them to send a message. Heresy would not be tolerated, but the message was not always received the way Mary intended. Some in the crowd wept, others muttered prayers for the victims. A few shouted encouragement to those being burned. Mary believed she was doing God's work. In her mind, killing heretics on earth was an act of mercy because it might save their souls from eternal hell. But to many of her people, the sight of burning flesh and the smell of death was horrifying. And yet, the burnings continued. Mary's court life was not all fire and fear. She loved music, embroidery, and riding. She had a pet parrot that amused guests by imitating voices. But the grand feasts and lavish entertainments of her father's reign were rare. Mary was serious, reserved, and often sad. Her marriage to Philip did not bring her much joy. He spent most of their time apart in Spain. Mary longed for a child, believing it would secure England's Catholic future. Twice, she thought she was pregnant. Both times, it turned out to be false. These disappointments deepened her loneliness. By October 1555, two of the most famous Protestant leaders in England, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, were burned together in Oxford. Witnesses later repeated Latimer's final words to Ridley. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle in England as I trust shall never be put out." That sentence became a rallying cry for English Protestants. Mary was unmoved. She saw them as traitors to the true faith. Even as flames rose in town squares, England was facing other troubles. Poor harvests left many hungry. Inflation made food expensive. A war with France ended in disaster when England lost Calais, its last territory in Europe. These problems made Mary even less popular. But she refused to change course. She believed that God's blessing depended on returning the country fully to Catholicism. If that meant more executions, so be it. By the end of 1555, more than 100 Protestants had been burned. They were not just famous leaders, but ordinary men and women, tailors, blacksmiths, widows, even teenagers. Some gave in at the last moment and accepted Catholic teachings. But many stood firm, meeting death with prayers on their lips. And this was only the beginning. The winter of 1556 brought no relief. The smoke of burning bodies had become a familiar sight across England. For some towns, it was a grim routine. A date announced, a crowd gathered, a pyre lit. For Mary, these executions were proof she was restoring the old faith. For her enemies, they were proof she had become one of the most feared rulers in English history. By now, the numbers were climbing fast. Historians believe that over the course of her reign, nearly 300 people were burned alive for heresy. Most died in public squares, tied to stakes, surrounded by wood and straw. Mary's government carefully recorded these burnings. The names, ages, and places of execution were written down as if they were legal business. Which, in a way, they were. These were not secret murders in dark alleys. They were official acts of the Crown, carried out with witnesses and paperwork. In London, the burnings often took place at Smithfield, a large open space used for markets, fairs, and public punishments. It was a place where laughter, music, and trade could, on another day, turn into a stage for human suffering. The authorities made sure the condemned were questioned in public before being tied to the stake. They were asked if they would accept the Catholic faith. They were told they could save their lives with just a few words. Many refused, choosing death over denial. Their courage, or stubbornness, depending on one's view, left a deep mark on witnesses. In some cases, the condemned sang psalms as the flames rose. Others prayed loudly until smoke filled their lungs. The smell of burning flesh drifted into nearby streets. People went home with the image burned into their minds. The goal was fear, but fear does not always work as planned. In Protestant families, these deaths became stories told in whispers, stories of martyrs, of brave men and women who would not bow to a queen's command. Mary knew she was hated by many, but she believed history would judge her kindly. She saw herself as a shepherd guarding her flock from wolves. In her mind, Protestantism was a dangerous infection, and burning heretics was the cure. Her chief advisor in these matters was Cardinal Reginald Pole, a man as committed to Catholic restoration as she was. Pole encouraged her to keep going, to cleanse the realm of false belief. But even some Catholic nobles began to worry. The burnings they feared were turning the public against the very faith Mary wanted to protect. Mary's personal life offered little comfort during these years. Her husband, Philip, had returned to Spain shortly after their wedding and stayed away for long stretches. He came back briefly in 1557, not out of love, but to convince England to join Spain in a war against France. Mary agreed, sending troops across the Channel. The war ended badly, with England losing Calais, its last possession in mainland Europe. Calais had been part of English pride for over 200 years. Losing it was a humiliation, and the blame fell squarely on Mary. At the same time, the Queen's health began to decline. She suffered from headaches, stomach pain, and depression. She still longed for a child, and once again believed she was pregnant. But the swelling in her belly was likely from illness, not life. When it became clear there was no baby, Mary's sadness deepened into despair. This grief only seemed to harden her resolve. She believed God was testing her. She would not give up her mission, even if it meant standing alone. One of the most famous burnings of her reign came in March 1556, the execution of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer had been the highest churchman in England under her father and brother, and he had played a major role in turning the country Protestant. When Mary took the throne, Cranmer was imprisoned. Under pressure, he signed papers admitting he had been wrong about religion. This should have saved him. But Mary wanted more than his submission. She wanted an example. On the day of his execution, Cranmer was brought to St. Mary's Church in Oxford to give a final speech. Many expected him to repeat his recantation. Instead, he shocked everyone. Cranmer publicly renounced the Catholic faith and declared that his earlier recantations had been lies made under fear. When he was led to the stake, he placed the hand that had signed those papers into the fire first, saying it should burn before the rest of his body. Witnesses never forgot the sight. For Protestants, Cranmer became a hero. For Mary, it was another act of defiance that only fueled her determination. By 1557, executions had spread across the country, from Kent to Norfolk, from Sussex to the West Country. The victims were men and women from all walks of life. Some were scholars, others simple farmers. One was a blind man who was burned alongside his wife. Another was a young woman accused of denying the real presence of Christ in the Mass. The burnings became so frequent that in some places, people stopped treating them as rare spectacles. They became grim routine, like bad weather that kept returning. And yet, even as her enemies called her Bloody Mary, the Queen did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as a savior of souls. But history is often kinder to those who spare lives than to those who take them. As the years passed, Mary's circle grew smaller. Her marriage remained cold. Philip visited only when politics required it. He was younger than Mary by more than 10 years, handsome but distant, and more concerned with his Spanish empire than with England or his wife. In the final year of her reign, England's troubles piled high. Harvest failures caused food shortages. The war with France drained the treasury. The loss of Calais was still a wound to national pride, and the burnings had not brought the religious unity Mary had hoped for. If anything, they had made England more divided. Even some Catholics whispered that the Queen's methods were too harsh. But Mary ignored them. She believed her duty was to God, not to popularity. In November 1558, Mary's health collapsed. She was only 42 years old, but years of stress, illness, and heartbreak had worn her down. Fevers shook her body. She had no husband at her side, no child to inherit her throne, and few allies left in her own court. On the morning of November 17th, she died quietly at St. James's Palace in London. Her half-sister Elizabeth, a Protestant, succeeded her. Almost immediately, the new queen ended the burnings and steered England back toward Protestantism. Mary Tudor left behind a complicated legacy. To Catholics, she had tried to save the soul of England. To Protestants, she was a tyrant who had killed innocent people for their beliefs. In the centuries that followed, Protestant writers would give her the nickname that still follows her today, Bloody Mary. The burnings she ordered became immortalized in works like Foxe's Book of Martyrs, which painted the victims as heroes and Mary as a cruel villain. Whether entirely fair or not, that image shaped how history remembers her. Her reign had lasted just over 5 years, yet in that short time she became one of the most infamous monarchs in English history. She had set out to heal the wounds caused by her father's break with Rome. Instead, she deepened the divide. The fires she lit in market squares and city streets burned more than the bodies of heretics. They burned her own place in history, branding her name forever with blood and smoke. Mary Tudor's death in 1558 closed a short, turbulent chapter in England's history. But the ripples of her choices spread far beyond her grave. Her successor, Elizabeth I, was quick to reverse many of Mary's policies, re-establishing Protestantism as the state religion. The burnings stopped almost overnight, replaced by a new political strategy that relied less on fire and more on careful image building. For Elizabeth, Mary's reign had provided a valuable lesson that fear could control, but it could also breed rebellion. Elizabeth would spend her own rule mastering a different kind of power, one rooted in careful compromise and public theatre. Mary's Catholic allies in Europe mourned her passing, but even they could not ignore the failure of her mission. The England she left behind was not a unified Catholic kingdom, but a nation hardened against Rome. The same fires that were meant to purify had instead solidified Protestant resistance. In the years after her death, Mary's memory became a weapon in the hands of her enemies. Protestant writers, especially John Foxe, painted her as a monster in the Book of Martyrs. These vivid accounts, often with emotional detail of the flames, the cries, and the courage of the condemned, cemented her reputation for cruelty. Whether or not every story was told exactly as it happened, the image of Bloody Mary became part of English cultural memory. For generations, her name would be invoked as a warning about the dangers of mixing religion and absolute power. School children learned of her as the queen who turned marketplaces into execution grounds. Yet history is rarely as simple as the legends it leaves behind. Mary had been shaped by a childhood filled with loss and betrayal. She saw her mother, Catherine of Aragon, cast aside by Henry VIII. She endured years of uncertainty over her own legitimacy. She grew up watching the kingdom's faith torn apart by politics. When she finally became queen, her mission to restore Catholicism was, in her eyes, not tyranny but justice, the rightful order restored. But the methods she chose ensured that her version of justice would be remembered not for its righteousness, but for its brutality. If Mary had ruled in an age less divided, perhaps her story would have been different. But the mid-16th century was a world where religion was inseparable from politics, where a monarch's faith could decide the fate of thousands. In that environment, compromise was rare, and mercy even rarer. Mary's tragedy lies not just in her failure, but in the way her personal wounds, political pressures, and unshakable beliefs combined to create a reign soaked in fire and fear. In the end, the smoke of her pyres drifted far beyond the towns where they were lit. It drifted into memory, into the stories told by survivors, into the history books that would define her for centuries. And there, in that mixture of fact and legend, Mary Tudor remains, a queen who believed she was saving England, but who instead became one of its darkest symbols.